Veteran saves kidnapped child. Parents discover his true identity. The sun hung high in the cloudless sky, casting a warm glow over the tranquil suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Grove. It was the kind of Saturday afternoon that seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with the promise of relaxation and family time. The air was thick with the scent of freshly mown grass and the distant sound of children's laughter. Claire Matthews stood at the kitchen window, absently stirring a pitcher of lemonade as she watched her husband, Michael, meticulously trim the edges of their well-manicured lawn. A smile played on her lips as she observed his concentration, his forehead creased in focus as he maneuvered the weed whacker with surgical precision. It was these simple moments of domesticity that Claire treasured most. Her gaze drifted down the street, where a group of neighborhood children had congregated. Among them was her 5-year-old daughter, Emily, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she skipped rope with her friends. Emily's laughter carried on the breeze, a sound that never failed to warm Claire's heart. "This is perfect," Claire thought to herself, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Oakwood Grove had always been a safe haven, the kind of place where parents felt comfortable letting their children play outside without constant supervision. It was a community where everyone knew each other, where doors were left unlocked, and where the biggest concern was usually whose turn it was to host the next neighborhood barbecue. As Claire turned back to the counter to finish preparing lunch, she had no inkling that this idyllic afternoon was about to shatter into a nightmare. Outside, Michael wiped the sweat from his brow, pausing to admire his handiwork. The lawn looked immaculate, the edges crisp and clean. He was about to call it a day when something caught his eye. A van he didn't recognize was crawling down the street, moving unusually slowly. Michael frowned, a vague sense of unease creeping over him. Before he could process what was happening, the van suddenly accelerated, screeching to a halt near the group of playing children. In a blur of motion that seemed to defy the lazy afternoon, a man leapt from the vehicle. Michael's heart stopped as he realized the stranger was heading straight for Emily, who had wandered slightly away from her friends. "Emily!" Michael screamed, dropping the weed whacker and breaking into a sprint. But he was too far away, too slow. The world seemed to move in slow motion as he watched the stranger scoop up his daughter, her small form struggling against the man's grip. The other children's screams pierced the air, a cacophony of terror that shattered the peaceful neighborhood. In mere seconds, the van's door slammed shut, Emily's muffled cries barely audible as the vehicle peeled away, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and the echoes of screeching tires. Michael's legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees in the middle of the street, his anguished cry tearing through the neighborhood. "No! Emily! Emily!" The commotion drew Claire from the house, the pitcher of lemonade slipping from her hands and shattering on the porch as she took in the scene. Her eyes met Michael's, and in that moment, their world imploded. Without a word, she knew. Their daughter was gone. As if a switch had been flipped, the peaceful neighborhood erupted into chaos. Doors flew open as neighbors poured out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. Parents frantically gathered their children, holding them close as the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. Phones were pulled out, fingers shaking as they dialed 911, voices trembling as they reported the unthinkable. In the midst of the growing pandemonium, a solitary figure stood apart from the crowd, observing the scene with a calculated calm that seemed at odds with the surrounding panic. Jack Turner, a man few in the neighborhood knew well, had been walking his dog, Max, when the kidnapping occurred. To the casual observer, Jack might have seemed oddly detached from the situation. But behind his stoic exterior, his mind was racing, years of military training kicking into high gear. Jack was a ghost in Oakwood Grove, a man who existed on the periphery of the community. He lived in a small, weathered house at the end of Maple Street, the kind of place most people's eyes skipped over. The neighbors knew little about him, only that he was a veteran who kept to himself. Some found his reclusiveness off-putting, while others simply accepted it as a quirk of his character. What none of them knew was that Jack Turner was far more than just a quiet veteran. He was a former member of an elite special forces unit, a man who had seen and done things that would haunt most people's nightmares. His time in the military had honed his senses to a razor's edge, and even now, years after leaving active duty, those instincts remained sharp. As he stood watching the chaos unfold, Jack's mind was already several steps ahead. His keen eyes had caught details others had missed in the panic: the make and model of the van, a partial license plate, the direction it had headed. He knew that every second counted in a situation like this. The police would be called, of course, but Jack understood better than most the critical nature of those first few minutes in a kidnapping. Without a word to anyone, Jack turned and began walking briskly back to his house, Max trotting obediently at his heels. To anyone who might have noticed, it would have seemed as though the reclusive veteran was simply retreating from the commotion, wanting no part in the neighborhood's tragedy. But as Jack reached his driveway, his pace quickened. He entered his house, emerging moments later with a determined set to his jaw. The old truck that usually sat dormant in his driveway roared to life, and before anyone in the distracted neighborhood could take notice, Jack and Max were gone, heading in the direction the kidnapper's van had taken. As Claire and Michael clung to each other in the middle of the street, their world crumbling around them, they remained unaware that their daughter's fate now rested in the hands of the neighborhood's most enigmatic resident. Jack Turner, the man they barely knew, was now Emily's only hope. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as the first police cars entered Oakwood Grove. But by then, Jack was already miles away, his truck eating up the road as he pursued the kidnapper with a single-minded focus. The hunt was on, and Jack Turner was in his element once more. The old truck's engine growled as Jack pressed the accelerator, his eyes scanning the road ahead with laser-like focus. The peaceful suburban streets gave way to less traveled back roads, each turn taking him further from the chaos he'd left behind in Oakwood Grove. Beside him, Max sat alert, his ears perked forward, sensing the urgency in his master's demeanor. Jack's mind raced, processing information with the speed and precision that had once made him an invaluable asset to his military unit. The van, a white Ford E-Series, at least 10 years old, with a dent on the rear bumper. The partial plate he'd glimpsed: 7XQ. The driver, male, Caucasian, approximately 5'10", dark hair. Each detail was a piece of the puzzle, a breadcrumb on the trail he now followed. As he drove, Jack's thoughts briefly flitted to the scene he'd left behind. He could imagine the police arriving, the parents, anguish, the neighbors, shock. Part of him felt a twinge of guilt for not staying to provide information, but he knew that every second counted. By the time the authorities organized a search, the trail could go cold. This was a job for someone with his particular set of skills. The roads became increasingly rural, winding through dense forests and past abandoned farmhouses. Jack's instincts, honed by years of tracking enemies through far more hostile terrains, guided his decisions at each intersection. He knew the kidnapper would seek isolation, a place to regroup and plan his next move. "What do you think, Max?" Jack murmured, glancing at his canine companion. Max whined softly, his nose twitching as if he could scent their quarry on the air. The bond between man and dog went beyond mere companionship. Max was as much a part of Jack's past as the scars that crisscrossed his body, hidden beneath his civilian clothes. As they drove, Jack's mind drifted to memories he usually kept locked away: the sweltering heat of Afghan deserts, the oppressive humidity of Southeast Asian jungles, missions where success meant lives saved, and failure. He pushed the thought away. This was not the time for ghosts of the past. A child's life hung in the balance, and Jack was determined that this mission would not end in failure. An hour into the pursuit, Jack spotted something that made his heart race. Ahead, partially concealed by overgrown bushes, was a dirt road leading off into the woods. Most would have missed it, but Jack's trained eye caught the fresh tire tracks cutting through the undergrowth. Without hesitation, he turned onto the narrow path, the truck's suspension groaning as it navigated the uneven terrain. The dirt road wound through the forest for several miles before opening up into a small clearing. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he saw it: the white van, parked haphazardly in front of an old, dilapidated warehouse. The building looked long abandoned, its windows boarded up and its metal siding rusted and peeling. Jack pulled his truck off the road, concealing it behind a thick copse of trees. He sat for a moment, studying the scene before him. The van's engine was off, and there was no sign of movement around the warehouse. The kidnapper and Emily were inside. He was certain of it. Turning to Max, Jack spoke in a low, commanding tone. "Stay," he ordered, knowing the dog would remain in the truck until called. Max whined softly but obeyed, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. With the silently practiced movements, Jack reached under his seat and retrieved a small go bag. From it, he produced a compact pair of binoculars and a wickedly sharp combat knife. The familiar weight of the blade in his hand brought a flood of memories, some he'd rather forget, others that had kept him alive in the darkest of circumstances. Jack moved through the forest with the silent grace of a predator, his feet finding purchase on the soft earth without disturbing so much as a leaf. As he approached the warehouse, he could hear the faint sound of voices carried on the breeze, a man's gruff tones, punctuated by the muffled sobs of a child. Anger flared in Jack's chest, a cold, focused rage that he channeled into heightened awareness. He had seen the worst of humanity in his years of service, had confronted evil in its many forms. But there was something particularly abhorrent about those who preyed on the innocent, on children who should be safe in their own neighborhoods. Crouching behind a rusted oil drum, Jack raised the binoculars to his eyes. Through a gap in the warehouse's boarded windows, he could make out two figures. The kidnapper paced back and forth, a cell phone pressed to his ear, his face contorted with anxiety. In the corner, huddled on the dirty floor, was Emily. Her face was tear-stained, her small body shaking with fear, but she appeared unharmed. Jack's mind raced, formulating a plan. The kidnapper was distracted, likely trying to arrange the next phase of his ill-conceived plan. This was the window of opportunity he needed. But he had to move fast. The longer Emily remained in that monster's clutches, the greater the danger. With a deep breath, Jack steeled himself for what was to come. He had left this life behind, had sought peace and solitude to escape the violence that had defined his existence for so long. But in this moment, he knew that his past, with all its pain and darkness, had prepared him for this very situation. He was Emily's only hope, the sole barrier between an innocent child and unthinkable harm. As Jack began to move towards the warehouse, a twig snapped under his foot. He froze, his heart pounding. Inside, the kidnapper's voice faltered, and for a moment, silence fell over the clearing. Jack held his breath, every muscle in his body tense, ready to spring into action if he'd been detected. After what felt like an eternity, the kidnapper resumed his conversation, his voice fading as he moved deeper into the warehouse. Jack exhaled slowly, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, sharpening his focus to a razor's edge. He crept forward, hugging the shadows, his movements fluid and purposeful. As he reached the warehouse's rusted metal door, Jack paused, his hand on the handle. In his mind, he could hear the voices of his old team, the men he'd fought and bled alongside in countless operations. Their training echoed in his head, a mantra that had kept him alive in the world's most dangerous places. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. With a silent prayer to whatever higher power might be listening, Jack took a deep breath and prepared to enter the warehouse. The familiar calm of impending action settled over him, pushing away all distractions. In this moment, he wasn't Jack Turner, the reclusive veteran struggling with the ghosts of his past. He was once again the elite soldier, the protector, the last line of defense for those who couldn't defend themselves. As he eased the door open, the rusty hinges protesting softly, Jack's resolve hardened. He would save Emily. Failure was not an option, and God help the man who stood in his way. The interior of the warehouse was a study in shadows and decay. Shafts of late-afternoon sunlight pierced through gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the stale air. The smell of rust and mildew assaulted Jack's nostrils as he slipped inside, his eyes quickly adjusting to the dim light. Jack moved with the fluid grace of a panther, each step calculated and silent. His senses, honed by years of high-stakes operations, were on high alert. He could hear the kidnapper's voice echoing from deeper within the building, the man's tone growing increasingly agitated as he argued with someone on the phone. "I don't care what you think," the kidnapper hissed, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the cavernous space. "This wasn't the plan. You said it would be easy money. In and out. Now the whole town's probably looking for her. What am I supposed to do?" Jack's jaw clenched as he listened. The realization that this was more than just a random kidnapping, that there were others involved, only heightened the urgency of the situation. He needed to act fast, before the kidnapper's unseen partners could complicate things further. Creeping forward, Jack navigated through a maze of abandoned machinery and rusted metal shelving. His eyes never stopped moving, cataloging potential weapons, escape routes, and vantage points. In his mind, he was already several moves ahead, planning for every contingency. As he rounded a corner, Jack finally caught sight of Emily. The little girl was huddled in a corner, her small frame shaking with silent sobs. Her pink dress was smudged with dirt, and her blonde pigtails were askew, but she appeared physically unharmed. The sight of her, so vulnerable and afraid, stirred something deep within Jack, a protective instinct that went beyond his military training. The kidnapper paced back and forth just a few yards away, his back to Emily as he continued his heated phone conversation. Jack sized him up quickly. Early 30s, medium build, no visible weapons aside from a switchblade clipped to his belt. The man's body language spoke of nervousness and inexperience. This was not a hardened criminal, but rather, someone who had gotten in way over his head. Jack weighed his options. He could try to take the kidnapper by surprise, but any sudden noise might cause the man to panic and potentially harm Emily. A direct confrontation was risky, but allowing the situation to drag on was equally dangerous. Jack's mind raced, years of tactical training coalescing into a plan of action. Silently, Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal object, a ball bearing from one of the abandoned machines. With practiced precision, he tossed it across the warehouse, where it clattered loudly against a far wall. The effect was instantaneous. The kidnapper whirled around, his phone call forgotten as he stared wide-eyed into the shadows. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling with fear and bravado. "I'm warning you. I'm armed." Jack remained motionless, blending into the darkness as the kidnapper's eyes darted frantically around the warehouse. Slowly, the man began to edge towards the sound, his hand hovering near the switchblade on his belt. This was the opening Jack had been waiting for. As the kidnapper moved away from Emily, Jack sprang into action. He crossed the distance between them in a matter of seconds, his footsteps eerily silent on the concrete floor. The kidnapper sensed movement behind him and started to turn, but it was too late. Jack's arm snaked around the man's neck, applying pressure to the carotid artery in a textbook chokehold. The kidnapper's eyes bulged in surprise and fear as he struggled against Jack's iron grip. "Don't fight it," Jack whispered, his voice low and controlled. "It'll be over quicker if you don't resist." The kidnapper's struggles grew weaker as the blood flow to his brain was restricted. Within seconds, his eyes rolled back and he slumped unconscious in Jack's arms. Jack eased the man to the ground, quickly securing his hands behind his back with a zip tie from his pocket. With the immediate threat neutralized, Jack turned his attention to Emily. The little girl was staring at him with wide, fearful eyes, unsure if this new stranger was friend or foe. Jack approached slowly, his hands held out in a non-threatening manner. "It's okay, Emily," he said softly, crouching down to her level. "I'm here to take you home. Your mom and dad sent me to find you." Emily's lower lip trembled as she looked up at Jack. "Really?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "You know my mommy and daddy?" Jack nodded, offering a gentle smile. "I do. They're very worried about you, and they can't wait to see you again. Do you think you can be brave for them and come with me?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a flicker of hope replacing the fear in her eyes. Jack held out his hand, and Emily took it, her small fingers clinging to him like a lifeline. As Jack led Emily towards the warehouse exit, a groan from behind them made him tense. The kidnapper was starting to regain consciousness. Jack knew they needed to move quickly. "Emily," he said, kneeling down to look her in the eye. "I need you to do something very important for me. Can you close your eyes and cover your ears for a minute? I promise I'll tell you when it's okay to look again." Emily nodded solemnly, squeezing her eyes shut and pressing her hands over her ears. Jack turned back to the kidnapper, who was now blinking groggily, confusion and fear warring on his face as he realized his predicament. With quick, efficient movements, Jack gagged the man and secured his ankles, ensuring he wouldn't be able to escape or call for help. He then reached into the kidnapper's pocket and retrieved his cell phone, pocketing it as potential evidence. Satisfied that the threat was fully contained, Jack returned to Emily. He gently tapped her shoulder, and she opened her eyes, looking up at him trustingly. "You did great," Jack said warmly. "Now, let's get you out of here and back to your parents. How does that sound?" Emily managed a small smile, nodding eagerly. Jack scooped her up into his arms, and she buried her face in his shoulder, her small body relaxing as she sensed that she was finally safe. As they stepped out of the warehouse into the fading afternoon light, Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. The hard part was over, but he knew the journey wasn't finished yet. They still had to make it back to Oakwood Grove, back to Emily's anxious parents, and the avalanche of questions that would inevitably follow. Jack made his way back to his truck, Emily still cradled securely in his arms. As they approached, Max's head popped up, his tail wagging furiously at the sight of his master. Emily's eyes widened with delight at the sight of the dog. "This is Max," Jack explained as he opened the passenger door. "He's my partner, and a very good friend. Would you like to sit with him on the way home?" Emily nodded enthusiastically, her earlier fear seemingly forgotten in the presence of the friendly dog. Jack carefully settled her into the seat, and Max immediately lay his head in her lap, his brown eyes looking up at her adoringly. As Jack started the engine, he glanced at Emily in the rearview mirror. She was gently petting Max's head, a look of contentment on her face that belied the ordeal she had just endured. In that moment, Jack felt a surge of emotion he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose, of having done something unequivocally good. The truck rumbled to life, and Jack steered it back onto the bumpy dirt road. As they made their way out of the woods and back toward civilization, Jack's mind was already racing ahead. He knew that returning Emily safely was only the beginning. There would be police statements to give, questions to answer, a community's curiosity to navigate. For a man who had spent years avoiding attention and connection, the road ahead seemed daunting. But as he glanced again at Emily, now dozing peacefully with her hand resting on Max's fur, Jack knew he had made the right choice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them, just as he had faced the dangers of this day. The sun was setting as they drove, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. It was a beautiful sight, a reminder of the world's capacity for wonder, even in the aftermath of darkness. As Oakwood Grove appeared on the horizon, Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The quiet anonymity of his life was about to end, but in its place, a new chapter was beginning. And for the first time in years, Jack found himself looking forward to what the future might hold. The streets of Oakwood Grove were a far cry from the peaceful suburb Jack had left behind just hours ago. As his truck rumbled down Maple Street, he was met with a scene of controlled chaos. Police cars lined the curb, their lights painting the darkening sky in alternating flashes of red and blue. Neighbors huddled in small groups on their lawns, their faces etched with worry and fear. Jack's arrival did not go unnoticed. Heads turned as the unfamiliar truck made its way down the street, curiosity and suspicion mingling in the onlookers' eyes. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. For a moment, Jack was tempted to turn around, to retreat to the safety and anonymity of his solitary life. But a small movement beside him steeled his resolve. Emily had woken up as they entered the neighborhood, her eyes wide as she took in the familiar surroundings. "Are we home?" she asked softly, her voice still tinged with lingering fear. Jack nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "Yes, we're home. Your mom and dad are waiting for you." As if on cue, a commotion erupted further down the street. Jack could see Claire and Michael Matthews on their front lawn, surrounded by police officers and concerned neighbors. The moment Claire spotted the truck, her eyes locked onto it with laser-like focus. Even from a distance, Jack could see the mix of hope and terror warring on her face. He pulled the truck to a stop a short distance from the Matthews home, knowing that approaching too quickly might cause panic. Taking a deep breath, Jack turned to Emily. "Are you ready to see your parents?" he asked gently. Emily nodded, a smile breaking across her face for the first time since her ordeal began. It was a sight that warmed Jack's heart, a reminder of why he had chosen to get involved. As Jack stepped out of the truck, he could hear Claire's voice rising above the din. "Emily! Emily!" The raw emotion in her cry was enough to make even the hardened veteran's throat tighten. Jack moved around to the passenger side, opening the door and helping Emily out. The moment her feet touched the ground, Emily's eyes found her parents. "Mommy! Daddy!" she cried, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. What followed was a blur of motion and emotion. Claire and Michael raced towards their daughter, their faces a mixture of joy, relief, and lingering fear. Emily broke away from Jack, running towards her parents with arms outstretched. The reunion was explosive in its intensity. Claire reached Emily first, scooping her daughter into her arms and falling to her knees on the grass. Michael enveloped them both, his broad shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The three clung to each other as if afraid that loosening their grip might cause Emily to disappear again. Jack stood back, watching the scene unfold with a lump in his throat. He had seen many things in his life, had experienced the highs and lows of human emotion in the crucible of war. But this, the pure, unadulterated love and relief radiating from the Matthews family, was something that touched even his battle-hardened heart. As the initial shock of the reunion began to subside, Jack became aware of the growing crowd around them. Neighbors pressed closer, their earlier fear giving way to joy and curiosity. Police officers approached, their faces a mix of relief and professional interest. Claire looked up from where she knelt, still holding Emily tightly. Her tear-streaked face turned towards Jack, a question forming on her lips. Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice hoarse with emotion. Jack shifted uncomfortably, unused to being the center of attention. "I'm Jack Turner," he said simply. "I live down the street. I saw what happened, and I did what needed to be done." Michael, his arms still wrapped protectively around his wife and daughter, stepped forward. His eyes searched Jack's face, as if trying to reconcile this quiet man with the heroic act he had performed. "How did you find her?" he asked, his voice thick with gratitude and lingering disbelief. Jack hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. He was saved from immediate response by the approach of a police officer, her badge identifying her as Detective Sarah Reeves. "Mr. Turner," Detective Reeves said, her tone professional but warm. "I think we're all very interested in hearing the full story, but first, I believe a medical check for Emily is in order. After that, we'll need to take your statement." Jack nodded, relieved at the momentary reprieve. As paramedics approached to check on Emily, he found himself surrounded by a mix of law enforcement and curious neighbors. The questions came rapid fire, a barrage of hows and whys that threatened to overwhelm him. Amidst the growing chaos, Jack felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down to see Emily standing beside him, her other hand still firmly grasped by her mother. The little girl looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Thank you for saving me," she said softly, her words cutting through the noise around them. In that moment, the commotion seemed to fade away. Jack knelt down to Emily's level, his usually stoic features softening into a gentle smile. "You're very welcome." "Emily," he replied, "you were very brave today." Claire, still holding tight to her daughter, met Jack's gaze. The gratitude in her eyes was almost palpable. "We can never thank you enough," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You brought our baby back to us." Michael nodded in agreement, reaching out to grasp Jack's shoulder. "Anything you need," Anything at all, he said earnestly. Your family now. As the paramedics gently led Emily and her parents towards a waiting ambulance for a precautionary checkup, Detective Reeves approached Jack once more. Mr. Turner, she said, her tone more conversational now. I think it's time we heard your side of the story. Are you ready to give your statement? Jack nodded, straightening up and squaring his shoulders. He knew that what would follow would be a delicate balance between truth and discretion. His past, with all its classified operations and covert missions, was not something he could fully disclose. Yet, he owed these people, Emily, her parents, and even the curious neighbors, some explanation of how he had accomplished what seemed impossible. I'm ready, Jack replied to Detective Reeves, his voice low but steady. But perhaps we could do this somewhere a bit more private? Detective Reeves nodded, understanding the sensitivity of the situation. She led Jack towards a police cruiser parked nearby, offering some semblance of privacy amidst the bustling crowd. As they walked, Jack could feel the eyes of the neighborhood upon him, a mixture of awe, gratitude, and burning curiosity in their gazes. Once seated in the relative quiet of the police car, Jack began his account. He spoke of noticing the van, of his quick decision to follow, carefully omitting details that might raise too many questions about his background. He described tracking the vehicle to the abandoned warehouse, his voice steady as he recounted the confrontation with the kidnapper. Detective Reeves listened intently, her pen scratching across her notebook as she documented Jack's statement. Her eyes narrowed slightly at points, and Jack could almost see the wheels turning in her mind, piecing together the parts of the story that didn't quite add up to that of an ordinary citizen's actions. Mr. Turner, she said finally, setting down her pen, I have to say, your actions today were nothing short of extraordinary. But I can't help but wonder, how exactly did you acquire the skills to track a kidnapper and successfully rescue a child, all on your own? Jack paused, choosing his words carefully. I served in the military, detective. My training, it stays with you, even years later. Detective Reeves nodded slowly, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. I see. Well, Mr. Turner, whatever your background, there's no doubt that your actions saved Emily's life today. On behalf of the department, and I'm sure the entire community, thank you. As they stepped out of the police car, Jack was immediately engulfed by the waiting crowd. Neighbors he had barely spoken to in years now pressed close, offering handshakes, pats on the back, and words of gratitude. The overwhelming positivity was almost dizzying for a man who had grown accustomed to solitude. Amidst the crowd, Jack spotted a familiar face, Officer Reynolds, a fellow veteran he had occasionally nodded to in passing. Reynolds approached, a look of newfound respect in his eyes. Turner, he said, extending his hand. I had no idea. All this time, I thought you were just a recluse, Jack finished with a wry smile, shaking Reynolds' hand. Sometimes it's easier that way. Reynolds nodded, understanding passing between them. Well, not anymore. I'd wager you're the hero of Oakwood Grove now. Before Jack could respond, he felt a tug on his sleeve. Looking down, he saw Emily, freshly checked by the paramedics and clutching a shock blanket around her shoulders. Her parents stood just behind her, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and profound relief. Mr. Jack, Emily said, her voice small but clear. Can Max come out and play? The simple, childlike request amidst the chaos of the evening brought a genuine smile to Jack's face. Of course, Emily, he replied, turning towards his truck where Max waited patiently. As Max bounded out of the vehicle, tail wagging furiously, a ripple of delight passed through the gathered crowd. Children, who had been clinging fearfully to their parents, legs now edged forward, drawn by the friendly dog. Emily giggled as Max licked her face, the trauma of the day momentarily forgotten in the joy of the moment. Claire and Michael approached Jack, their eyes brimming with unshed tears. We don't know how to thank you, Claire began, her voice thick with emotion. What you did for Emily, for us, we'll never be able to repay you. Jack shook his head, feeling slightly uncomfortable with their gratitude. "There's no need for thanks. I did what anyone would do." Michael clasped Jack's shoulder, his grip firm. "No, you did what only you could do, and we'll be forever grateful. Please, you must come to dinner. Let us do something, anything, to show our appreciation." As Jack opened his mouth to politely decline, he caught sight of Emily. She was kneeling beside Max, her small arms wrapped around the dog's neck, a look of pure contentment on her face. In that moment, Jack felt something shift within him. The walls he had built around himself over the years began to crumble, just a little. Dinner would be nice, he found himself saying, surprising even himself with the acceptance. The Matthews he faces lit up with genuine pleasure at his agreement. As they began to discuss details, Jack felt a strange sense of warmth spreading through him. It was unfamiliar, this feeling of connection, of being part of something larger than himself. For so long, he had convinced himself that isolation was the only way to cope with his past, to protect himself from the pain of loss and the weight of his experiences. But here, in the midst of this community he had kept at arm's length for so long, Jack began to see another possibility. Perhaps, in saving Emily, he had also opened a door for himself, a chance to step out of the shadows of his past and into a future filled with the warmth of human connection. As the evening wore on and the excitement began to die down, Jack found himself looking forward to the dinner with the Matthews family. It was a small step, but a significant one. For the first time in years, he was allowing himself to be seen, to be known. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be questions to answer, barriers to overcome. But as Jack watched Emily playing with Max, surrounded by the warmth of her family and the support of the community, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, in this quiet suburban neighborhood, he had finally found a place where he could not just exist, but truly live. The days following Emily's rescue brought a whirlwind of activity to Oakwood Grove. The once quiet suburb found itself thrust into the spotlight as news of the daring rescue spread. Reporters camped out on street corners, eager for any tidbit of information about the mysterious hero who had saved the day. For Jack, the sudden attention was profoundly unsettling. He had spent years cultivating anonymity, finding solace in the predictable routine of his solitary life. Now, he found himself the subject of intense curiosity, not just from the media, but from his neighbors as well. The dinner invitation from the Matthews family loomed large in Jack's mind. As the agreed-upon evening approached, he found himself growing increasingly anxious. It had been years since he had engaged in something as ordinary as a dinner with neighbors. The prospect was both alluring and terrifying. On the night of the dinner, Jack stood before the mirror in his sparsely furnished bedroom, adjusting the collar of a shirt that felt suddenly too tight. Max sat nearby, his tail thumping against the floor as he watched his master's unusual preparations. "What do you think, boy?" Jack asked, glancing at his canine companion. "Am I making a mistake?" Max cocked his head to the side, letting out a soft whine that seemed to convey both encouragement and concern. Jack smiled wryly, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I guess we've come too far to back out now." As Jack made his way down the street towards the Matthews home, he could feel the eyes of the neighborhood upon him. Curtains twitched as he passed, and a few brave souls even stepped out onto their porches, offering hesitant waves. Jack nodded in acknowledgement, still uncomfortable with the attention, but making an effort to be cordial. The Matthews house was awash with warm light, a beacon of welcome in the gathering dusk. Jack paused at the foot of the driveway, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Before he could second-guess his decision, the front door flew open, and Emily came bounding out. "Mr. Jack, you came!" she exclaimed, her face lit up with genuine joy. Any lingering doubts Jack had melted away in the face of the child's enthusiasm. Claire and Michael appeared in the doorway, their smiles warm and welcoming. "Jack, we're so glad you could make it," Claire said, ushering him inside. "Please, come in." The interior of the Matthews home was everything Jack's wasn't: warm, lived in, filled with family photos, and the comfortable clutter of a happy life. The aroma of a home-cooked meal filled the air, and Jack felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Longing, perhaps, for a life he had never allowed himself to have. As they settled around the dining room table, the conversation flowed more easily than Jack had anticipated. Emily chattered excitedly about her day at school, seemingly unaffected by her recent ordeal. Her resilience was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, and Jack found himself marveling at her ability to bounce back. It was during the main course that the tone of the evening shifted. Michael, who had been quietly observant for much of the meal, suddenly leaned forward, his expression serious. "Jack," he began, his voice low and earnest, "we can't thank you enough for what you did for Emily. But I have to ask, how did you do it? I mean, tracking a kidnapper, confronting him alone. That's not something just anyone could do." Jack felt a familiar tension creep into his shoulders. He had known this moment would come, had rehearsed his answers countless times in his head. But faced with the genuine curiosity and gratitude of the Matthews family, his carefully prepared explanations felt hollow. Before Jack could formulate a response, a knock at the door interrupted the moment. Claire excused herself to answer it, returning moments later with an unexpected guest, Officer Reynolds. "I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner," Reynolds said, his eyes locking onto Jack. "But there's something I think everyone here needs to know." Jack's heart sank as he recognized the folder in Reynolds' hands. He knew what it contained, the truth he had been trying to keep buried for so long. Reynolds took a deep breath, his gaze moving from Jack to the Matthews family. "I've been doing some digging since the rescue," he began. "And what I've found, well, it's pretty extraordinary." Opening the folder, Reynolds pulled out a photograph, a much younger Jack, dressed in full military gear, standing with a group of men whose faces had been blurred out. "Jack Turner isn't just a veteran," Reynolds explained. "He was a member of one of the most elite Special Forces units in the military, multiple tours of duty, numerous commendations, including a Silver Star for valor in combat." The room fell silent as the implications of Reynolds' words sank in. Emily's eyes were wide with wonder, while Claire and Michael exchanged looks of astonishment. Jack sat motionless, feeling as though the carefully constructed walls of his life were crumbling around him. Reynolds continued, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and respect. "The missions Jack was involved in are still classified, but from what I've been able to piece together, he's saved more lives and faced more danger than most of us could imagine." Jack closed his eyes, memories he had long suppressed flooding back. The sound of gunfire, the weight of responsibility for his team, the faces of those he couldn't save. It all came rushing back with an intensity that left him breathless. When he opened his eyes, he found everyone in the room staring at him with a new understanding. The awe in their gazes was almost too much to bear. Jack had spent years running from his past, convinced that the only way to find peace was to leave it all behind. But now, faced with the truth laid bare, he realized that perhaps he had been running from the wrong thing all along. "It's true," Jack said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil roiling within him. "Everything Officer Reynolds said is true, but it's not something I like to talk about. Those years, they weren't easy." The room fell into a hushed silence, the weight of Jack's admission hanging in the air. Emily, her young face a mixture of awe and confusion, was the first to break the silence. "So, you're like a real-life superhero?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Jack couldn't help but smile at her innocent interpretation. "No, Emily, I'm not a superhero. I'm just someone who did a job, a hard job, for a long time." Michael leaned forward, his earlier curiosity now tinged with a newfound respect. "Jack, we had no idea. All this time, we thought you were just a recluse," Jack finished for him, echoing his earlier conversation with Officer Reynolds. "That was the point. After I left the service, I needed space, time to process everything I'd seen and done." Claire reached across the table, gently placing her hand on Jack's arm. The warmth of her touch was both comforting and unsettling to a man who had grown unaccustomed to such gestures. "But why here?" she asked softly. "Why Oakwood Grove?" Jack's gaze drifted to the window, looking out at the quiet street beyond. "It's everything my life wasn't for so long," he explained. "Peaceful, predictable, safe. I thought if I could just blend in, become part of the background, maybe I could finally find some peace." Officer Reynolds, who had been standing quietly by, stepped forward. "Jack, I hope you don't mind me bringing this to light, but after what you did for Emily, for this community, people deserve to know the truth about the hero in their midst." Jack winced slightly at the word hero. It was a label he had never been comfortable with, even during his years of service. "I'm not a hero," he said firmly. "I just did what needed to be done, same as I always have." But as he looked around the table, at the faces of Emily, Claire, and Michael, Jack could see that his words weren't having the desired effect. In their eyes, he saw not just gratitude, but a deep, abiding respect. It was a look he had seen before, in the eyes of civilians he had helped in war-torn countries, in the faces of fellow soldiers he had fought alongside. Emily, her young mind still grappling with the revelations, spoke up again. "Mr. Jack, if you're not a superhero, then what are you?" The question, in its childlike simplicity, cut to the heart of Jack's struggle. For so long, he had defined himself by what he was not a civilian, not a soldier, not a part of the community around him. But now, faced with Emily's innocent inquiry, he found himself searching for a new definition. I'm someone who's trying to find his place in the world," Jack answered honestly. "Someone who's done a lot of hard things, seen a lot of hard things, and is trying to figure out how to live with all of that." Michael nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "And you thought the best way to do that was to shut yourself away from everyone?" Jack shrugged, a gesture that seemed to encompass years of pain and uncertainty. "It seemed like the safest option, for me and for everyone else." Claire, her hand still resting on Jack's arm, squeezed gently. "But it doesn't have to be that way anymore, Jack. What you did for Emily, it shows that you're still the same man who earned all those commendations. You're still someone who helps others, who makes a difference." Her words struck a chord deep within Jack, resonating with a part of himself he had long tried to suppress. The part that had driven him to enlist in the first place, that had pushed him to excel in the special forces, that had compelled him to rush to Emily's aid without a second thought. Officer Reynolds cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Jack, I know this isn't what you wanted, but I think it's important for you to know. The whole town's been talking about what you did. People are inspired. You've given them hope, shown them that there are still good people in the world willing to stand up and do the right thing, no matter the cost." Jack absorbed this information, feeling a mixture of discomfort and something else, a faint glimmer of pride, perhaps. Or maybe it was simply the realization that, despite his best efforts to remain invisible, he had made a tangible, positive impact on the lives of those around him. As the evening wore on, the conversation gradually shifted to lighter topics. Emily, her initial awe giving way to childlike curiosity, peppered Jack with questions about his military service. Which countries he'd visited, what kind of training he'd undergone, whether he'd ever jumped out of a plane. Jack answered as best he could, carefully omitting the more harrowing details while indulging the child's fascination. By the time dessert was served, a warm, companionable atmosphere had settled over the dining room. Jack found himself relaxing, drawn into the easy banter of family life that he had denied himself for so long. He even caught himself laughing, a rich, genuine sound that surprised him with its unfamiliarity. As the evening drew to a close, Jack stood to leave, feeling a strange reluctance to return to the solitude of his own home. At the door, Claire pulled him into an unexpected hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for Emily, but for trusting us with your story. You're always welcome here, Jack. Always." Michael shook his hand firmly, his grip conveying a depth of gratitude and respect that words couldn't express. And Emily, her eyes heavy with sleep, but still bright with admiration, gave him a gap-toothed grin. "Good night, Mr. Jack. Will you come back and visit soon?" As Jack made his way home, the cool night air filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, he felt something shift within him. The weight of his past, the burden of his secrets, seemed lighter somehow. In sharing his story, in allowing himself to be known, he had taken the first step on a new journey. The lights of his small house came into view, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a fortress of solitude. Instead, it felt like a starting point, a place from which he could begin to reconnect with the world around him, to find a new purpose that honored his past while embracing the possibilities of the future. As he unlocked his front door, Jack realized that in saving Emily, he may have also saved himself. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he found himself looking forward to what tomorrow might bring. The days following the revelation of Jack's true identity brought a seismic shift to the quiet rhythms of Oakwood Grove. The town, which had always prided itself on its close-knit community, found itself grappling with the realization that a bona fide war hero had been living in their midst all along. For Jack, the change was both profound and unsettling. His morning walks with Max, once exercises in blissful anonymity, now became occasions for impromptu conversations with neighbors. People who had previously averted their eyes or offered only cursory nods now went out of their way to greet him, their faces alight with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. The local coffee shop, a place Jack had frequented for years without ever exchanging more than a few words with the staff, suddenly became a hotbed of activity whenever he entered. The barista, a young woman named Sarah who had always regarded Jack with a sort of wary curiosity, now greeted him by name and insisted that his coffee was on the house for our local hero. Jack found himself torn between discomfort at the attention and a growing sense of connection to the community he had long held at arm's length. The walls he had built around himself over the years were crumbling, brick by brick, under the steady onslaught of goodwill from his neighbors. Claire and Michael Matthews, true to their word, became fixtures in Jack's life. What had started as a single dinner invitation blossomed into a standing engagement every Sunday. Jack found himself looking forward to these gatherings, to the warmth of family life that he had denied himself for so long. Emily, in particular, had latched onto Jack with the unabashed enthusiasm of childhood. She peppered him with questions about his military service, her young mind romanticizing his experiences in a way that both amused and saddened Jack. He did his best to satisfy her curiosity, while gently steering her away from the harsher realities of war. One Sunday afternoon, as Jack sat on the Matthews' back porch watching Emily play with Max in the yard, Michael joined him, 2 cold beers in hand. "You know," Michael said, handing Jack a bottle, "I don't think I've ever seen Emily take to someone the way she has to you. It's like you've become her personal superhero." Jack took a long swig of his beer, his eyes never leaving Emily as she threw a stick for Max to fetch. "I'm no superhero," he said softly. "Just a man who's seen too much and done things I'm not always proud of." Michael was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of Jack's words settle between them. "Maybe that's what makes you a hero in her eyes," he finally said. "Not the things you've done, but the way you carry them. The fact that you've seen the worst the world has to offer and still chose to do the right thing when it mattered most." Jack turned to look at Michael, surprised by the insight. For a moment, he saw not just Emily's father, but a man grappling with his own understanding of heroism and sacrifice. Before Jack could respond, Claire's voice called out from inside the house, "Dinner's ready. Emily, come wash up." As they made their way inside, Jack couldn't shake Michael's words from his mind. The idea that his struggles, the very things he had tried to hide from the world, could be seen as a source of strength was a perspective he had never considered. The dinner table was lively that evening, filled with the usual chatter and laughter that Jack had come to associate with these gatherings. As Emily regaled them with tales of her adventures at school, Jack found himself smiling more easily, laughing more freely than he had in years. It was towards the end of the meal that Claire cleared her throat, a slightly nervous expression on her face. "Jack," she began, "Michael and I have been talking, And, well, we have something we'd like to ask you. Jack set down his fork, his full attention on Claire. She continued, her words coming out in a rush. We've been thinking about Emily's future, about her safety, and after everything that's happened, we were wondering, would you consider being her godfather? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jack felt his breath catch in his throat, overwhelmed by the trust and affection implicit in their request. For a moment, he was transported back to his days in the military, to the bonds of brotherhood forged in the heat of battle. This was different, but no less profound, a family, not of blood, but of choice, offering him a place in their lives. Emily, picking up on the sudden tension in the room, looked between her parents and Jack with wide eyes. "What's a godfather?" she asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. Michael smiled gently at his daughter. "A godfather is someone special, sweetheart. Someone who promises to always be there for you, to help guide you and protect you as you grow up." Emily's face lit up with understanding. "Like Mr. Jack already does," she exclaimed. Her innocent observation broke the tension, eliciting chuckles from the adults. Jack felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he had almost forgotten, the simple joy of being needed, of being part of something larger than himself. I'd be honored," Jack finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "But are you sure? I mean, given my past?" Claire reached across the table, taking Jack's hand in hers. "It's because of your past that we're sure," she said firmly. "You've seen the worst the world has to offer, Jack, and you still chose to risk everything to save our daughter. There's no one we'd trust more with her future." As the reality of their offer sank in, Jack felt a shift within himself. The burden of his past, which had for so long felt like a wall separating him from the world, now seemed more like a foundation, a base of experience and strength from which he could help guide and protect this child who had come to mean so much to him. The conversation flowed late into the night, plans being made and stories shared. As Jack finally made his way home, the cool night air filled with the sounds of crickets and distant laughter from neighbors, backyard gatherings, he felt a profound sense of change settling over him. The weight of the Matthews offer, to be Emily's godfather, sat heavily on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a responsibility he found himself eager to bear. The following days saw a flurry of activity in Oakwood Grove, as news of Jack's new role in Emily's life spread through the community grapevine. What had started as curiosity and admiration for the town's reluctant hero now blossomed into full-fledged acceptance and support. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who lived 2 doors down from Jack, appeared on his porch one morning with a freshly baked apple pie. "For Emily's godfather," she said with a warm smile, pressing the still warm dish into his hands. "It's about time you had some sweetness in your life, Jack Turner." At the local hardware store, where Jack had always been a silent, efficient customer, the owner, Bob, insisted on giving him a discount on a set of tools. "Heard you might be fixing up that spare room of yours," Bob said with a knowing wink, "for when the little one comes to visit her godfather." Even at the park where Jack took Max for his daily runs, he found himself drawn into conversations with other dog owners and parents. They shared stories of their own children and godchildren, offering advice and support with a warmth that Jack found both overwhelming and oddly comforting. The change wasn't lost on Jack. He found himself smiling more, engaging in small talk that he would have avoided just weeks ago. The walls he had built around himself for so long were crumbling, brick by brick, under the steady onslaught of community goodwill. One evening, as Jack sat on his front porch watching the sunset, he saw a familiar figure approaching. Officer Reynolds, still in uniform, made his way up the walkway, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Evening, Jack," Reynolds said, settling into the chair next to him. "Quite a change around here lately, huh?" Jack nodded, taking a sip from the beer he'd been nursing. "You could say that, still getting used to it, to be honest." Reynolds was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You know," he finally said, "when I first dug up your file, I wasn't sure what to expect." Thought maybe you were hiding out here for a reason. But seeing how you've opened up, how you've embraced this community, it's like watching a man come back to life." Jack turned to look at Reynolds, surprised by the insight. "Feels a bit like that too," he admitted. "Didn't realize how much I'd cut myself off until now." Reynolds nodded, understanding in his eyes. "PTSD's a beast, Jack. We all deal with it in our own ways. But isolation, it's a temporary fix at best. What you're doing now, connecting with people, being there for that little girl, that's the real path to healing." As they sat in companionable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in vibrant hues, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the numbing quiet he had sought for so long, but a warm, living peace that came from being part of something larger than himself. The next Sunday dinner at the Matthews and house was a lively affair. Emily had insisted on helping Claire prepare the meal, resulting in a slightly lopsided but lovingly made lasagna. As they sat around the table, Jack found himself at the center of a conversation about his plans for the spare room in his house. "You should paint it purple," Emily declared, her face serious. "That's the best color for a princess room." Michael chuckled, ruffling his daughter's hair. "I'm not sure Uncle Jack wants a princess room, sweetheart. Maybe we should let him decide." Jack, caught off guard by the casual use of Uncle Jack, felt a warmth spread through his chest. "How about we compromise?" he suggested to Emily. "We could do one wall purple and keep the rest a nice neutral color. That way, it can be a princess room when you visit, but it won't scare away any other guests." Emily considered this for a moment before nodding solemnly. "Okay, but it has to be the wall behind the bed. That's the most important princess wall." As laughter filled the room, Jack caught Claire's eye. She was watching him with a mixture of gratitude and affection that made his throat tighten with emotion. In that moment, he realized that he wasn't just gaining a goddaughter. He was gaining a family. Later that evening, as Jack prepared to leave, Michael pulled him aside. "Jack," he said, his voice low and serious, "I want you to know how much it means to us, what you're doing. Not just agreeing to be Emily's godfather, but the way you've embraced it, the way you've opened yourself up to us, to the whole town." Jack nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "It's not always easy," he admitted. "Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, wondering if I'm doing the right thing, if I'm safe enough to be around her." Michael placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "That right there, that concern, that's what makes you the perfect person for this. You understand the weight of it, and you're not alone in this, Jack. We're here for you, just as much as you're here for Emily." As Jack made his way home that night, the streets of Oakwood Grove seemed different. The houses were no longer just buildings he passed on his walks, but homes filled with people he was beginning to know and care about. The town that had once felt like a hiding place now felt like a community, his community. Stepping into his house, Jack's eyes fell on the boxes of paint and supplies stacked in the corner. Tomorrow, he would start work on Emily's room. It was a small step, but a significant one. He was no longer just existing in this space, but creating a home, not just for himself, but for the family he had unexpectedly found. As he settled into bed that night, Jack felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new connections, new opportunities to heal and grow. And for the first time in a long time, he found himself looking forward to facing them all. The old Jack Turner, the solitary figure who had hidden from the world, was fading away. In his place was emerging a man ready to embrace life again, with all its joys and sorrows, its challenges and rewards. As he drifted off to sleep, Jack's last thought was of Emily's smile and the promise of the future they would build together. The months that followed Jack's acceptance of the role of Emily's godfather brought a transformation to Oakwood Grove that few could have predicted. What had begun as a single act of heroism had blossomed into a ripple effect of positive change throughout the community. Jack I, once the town's enigmatic recluse, found himself at the center of this change. The spare room in his house, now painted with one vibrant purple wall as promised, became a second home to Emily. Her laughter, once foreign to the quiet halls of Jack's house, now filled the space with a warmth he hadn't realized he'd been missing. But it wasn't just Emily who brought new life to Jack's world. The Matthews family had become a constant presence, their Sunday dinners expanding to include impromptu weeknight visits and lazy Saturday afternoons in Jack's backyard. Michael and Claire, true to their word, had embraced Jack not just as Emily's godfather, but as a member of their family. The change in Jack was evident to all who knew him. The hard lines of his face, etched by years of solitude and unspoken trauma, had softened. His smiles, once rare and fleeting, now came easily and often. Even his posture had changed, the defensive hunch of his shoulders giving way to a more open, relaxed stance. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Jack watched Emily and Max play in a pile of fallen leaves, he found himself reflecting on the journey of the past few months. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention, and he turned to see Officer Reynolds making his way across the lawn. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Reynolds said, nodding towards Emily's gleeful face as she tossed armfuls of leaves into the air. Jack nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Never thought I'd see anything like this in my yard," he admitted. "Hell, never thought I'd want to." Reynolds chuckled, his eyes knowing. "Life has a funny way of giving us what we need, even when we think we don't want it." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "You know, Jack, what you've done here. It's more than just saving one little girl. You've inspired this whole town." Jack raised an eyebrow, skepticism clear in his face. "I'm not sure about that. I just did what needed to be done." Reynolds shook his head, a hint of fond exasperation in his voice. "That's just it, Jack. You did what needed to be done, without hesitation, without thought for yourself. And people have taken notice. You've reminded everyone what it means to be part of a community, to look out for each other." As if to illustrate Reynolds' point, Mrs. Henderson chose that moment to appear at the fence separating their yards, a fresh batch of cookies in hand. "Thought you and your little visitor might like a snack," she called out, her weathered face creased in a warm smile. Jack thanked her, marveling once again at the easy generosity that had become commonplace in his life. As Mrs. Henderson chatted with Reynolds, Jack called Emily over, watching as she bounded across the lawn, leaves clinging to her hair and clothes. "Cookie time," he announced, unable to suppress a grin at her excited squeal. As Emily munched happily on her treat, Jack found himself surveying the scene before him. His yard, once a meticulously maintained buffer between himself and the world, had become a gathering place. The fence that had seemed so necessary now felt more like a relic of his past isolation. Later that evening, after Emily had been picked up by her parents and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Jack sat on his porch, nursing a cup of coffee. The street was peaceful, but not in the empty way he had once preferred. He could hear the distant sound of a neighbor's television, the faint laughter from a backyard gathering a few houses down. These sounds, once intrusions, now felt like a comforting reminder of the life that surrounded him. His phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Emily can't stop talking about her day with Uncle Jack. Thank you for being such a wonderful part of her life." Jack felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. He typed back a quick reply, marveling at how natural it felt to engage in this casual communication, to be an active part of someone else's life. As he sat there, enjoying the cool evening air, Jack's mind wandered to the future. For so long, he had lived day to day, focused only on getting through each moment without succumbing to the weight of his past. Now, for the first time in years, he found himself making plans. There was talk of a community center in town, a place for veterans to gather and support each other. The mayor had approached Jack about being involved, citing his unique perspective and the respect he had earned in the community. At first, the idea had terrified him. The thought of being so publicly associated with his military past was daunting. But as he considered it more, Jack began to see the potential for healing, not just for himself, but for others who might be struggling as he had. Emily had also been dropping not-so-subtle hints about a camping trip. The idea of sharing his outdoor skills, of teaching her about nature and survival in a positive context, filled Jack with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. It was a far cry from the high-stakes operations of his military days, but in many ways, it felt more important. As the night deepened and Jack prepared to head inside, he paused for a moment, taking in the quiet street. He thought about the man he had been just months ago, isolated, haunted, existing rather than living. The change in his life was profound, almost unbelievable. Yet here he was, a godfather, a friend, a valued member of the community. The skills that had once set him apart, that had been a source of pride in war but a burden in peace, had become a gift. He had found a way to use his training not to destroy or to hide, but to protect, to nurture, to build connections. Jack realized that in saving Emily, he had indeed saved himself. The act of heroism that had thrust him into the spotlight had also opened a door to a life he never knew he wanted, a life rich with relationships, purpose, and the simple joys of everyday existence. As he turned to go inside, Jack caught sight of his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was different from the one who had hidden away for so long. There was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a softness to his features that spoke of inner peace. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect autumn day. Jack rose early, as was his habit. But instead of the solitary routine he had maintained for years, he found himself looking forward to the day ahead. He had promised to help Michael with some yard work, and later, he was meeting with the mayor to discuss the proposed Veterans Center. As he stepped outside with Max for their morning walk, Jack was greeted by the sight of Emily waiting at the end of his driveway, her backpack slung over her shoulder, and a wide grin on her face. "Uncle Jack," she called out, waving enthusiastically. "Can I walk with you and Max to the bus stop?" Jack felt a smile spread across his face, the kind of genuine, unguarded expression that had once been so rare for him. "Of course, kiddo," he replied, his voice warm with affection. "Max and I would love the company." As they set off down the street, Emily's small hand slipping naturally into his, Jack marveled at how quickly this had become normal. The little girl chattered away about her upcoming school day, her excitement infectious. Jack found himself offering words of encouragement about a spelling test she was nervous about, drawing on patience he never knew he possessed. They reached the bus stop just as other neighborhood children were arriving. Jack noticed the way the other parents looked at him, not with the wary curiosity of before, but with warm smiles and friendly nods. He was no longer the neighborhood oddity, but a trusted figure, a protector. As the school bus pulled up, Emily gave Jack a quick hug before bounding up the steps. "Bye, Uncle Jack," she called out. "Don't forget, we're planning our camping trip this weekend." Jack waved as the bus pulled away, a mixture of emotions welling up inside him. Pride, joy, a touch of anxiety about the upcoming camping trip, all feelings he had thought long lost to him. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Helping Michael with the yard work turned into an impromptu neighborhood gathering, with other residents stopping by to lend a hand or share a cold drink. Jack found himself engaged in easy conversation, sharing stories and laughs with people he had once gone out of his way to avoid. The meeting with the mayor about the Veterans Center went better than Jack could have hoped. His ideas were met with enthusiasm, and he found himself appointed to a steering committee to help bring the project to fruition. As he left City Hall, Jack felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since his military days, but this time, it was about building and healing, not combat and survival. That evening, as Jack sat on his porch enjoying the sunset, he reflected on the incredible journey of the past few months. The act of saving Emily had been instinctive, a reflexive response born of his training and his innate sense of right and wrong. He couldn't have imagined then how that single moment would ripple out, transforming not just his life, but the entire community. He thought about the man he had been, isolated, haunted by his past, existing rather than living. That man seemed like a stranger now, a fading memory being replaced by someone new, someone who could laugh freely, who could open his heart to a child's love, who could use his skills to build and strengthen a community. The sound of a car pulling up broke Jack from his reverie. He looked up to see Claire and Michael's SUV, with Emily waving excitedly from the back seat. As the family piled out, laden with takeout containers and board games, Jack felt a warmth spread through his chest. "Hope you're hungry," Michael called out, holding up bags of food. "We thought we'd have an impromptu family game night, if you're up for it." "Uncle Jack, I brought Monopoly," Emily added, her voice filled with excitement. Jack stood, welcoming them with a wide smile. "Sounds perfect," he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. As they settled into the living room, spreading out the food and setting up the game board, Jack took a moment to really look at the scene before him. This was his life now, filled with laughter, love, and connection. The ghosts of his past, while not entirely gone, had receded, replaced by the warmth of the present and the promise of the future. Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. "Uncle Jack, you're the dog piece, remember? That's your favorite." Jack chuckled, picking up the small metal dog and placing it on the starting square. "You're right, kiddo. How could I forget?" As the game progressed, filled with playful banter and dramatic dice rolls, Jack found himself fully present in the moment. The weight of his past, which had for so long felt like a wall separating him from the world, now seemed more like a foundation, a base of experience and strength from which he could build a new life, rich with meaning and connection. Later that night, after the Matthews had gone home and Jack was tidying up, he paused by the window. The street outside was quiet, but not in the oppressive way it had once felt. Now, it was a peaceful quiet, filled with the promise of tomorrow's activities and interactions. Jack realized that in saving Emily, he had indeed saved himself. The act of heroism that had thrust him into the spotlight had also opened a door to a life he never knew he wanted, a life rich with relationships, purpose, and the simple joys of everyday existence. As he turned off the lights and headed to bed, Jack felt a sense of contentment that had eluded him for years. He was no longer just a former soldier, no longer just a man defined by his past. He was Uncle Jack, a friend, a neighbor, a valued member of the community. He was, in the truest sense of the word, home. The next morning would bring new challenges and opportunities, a camping trip to plan, a veterans center to help build, a goddaughter to guide and protect. But for the first time in a long time, Jack Turner was looking forward to it all, ready to embrace whatever life had in store for him. As he drifted off to sleep, the last thing Jack saw was the framed photo on his bedside table, a snapshot of him with Emily and Max, all three laughing in the sunshine. It was a perfect reminder of how far he had come and of all the wonderful possibilities that still lay ahead. In the quiet of the night, in a house that had once felt like a fortress but now felt like a home, Jack Turner slept peacefully, a smile on his face, ready to greet the dawn of another day in his new life, a life transformed by a single act of heroism and sustained by the enduring power of love, community, and second chances.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.